Some believe as many as 40,000 people could die from food and soil contamination over the next several decades due to the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Scientists are now studying the official Soviet report on the disaster.
At the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, April 26, 1986, began as a normal day but quickly changed into a global disaster. As the safety test was occurring, reactor number 4 exploded and released radioactive material that spread across Ukraine. Rushing into the power plant with barely any equipment, first responders and workers had faced unknown dangers. Unaware of being evacuated in a couple of hours, the day-to-day people in Pripyat went about their ordinary lives, later to abandon their homes, schools, and lifestyles. The 1986 Chernobyl disaster showed health problems within the Soviet Union, guiding the use of liquidators to reduce radiation and the evacuation of Pripyat. The disaster led to the end of the Soviet Union, had a major impact on global nuclear safety regulations, and revolutionized the way governments handle nuclear disasters. The Soviet Union had invested in nuclear energy before the Chernobyl accident to supply power needs. Nuclear energy had been seen as a better alternative during the 1960s and 1970s due to the huge amounts of energy at a lower cost. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant was confirmed to be constructed on April 27, 1970, in northern Ukraine. The RBMK reactor was graphite moderated and what the plant was mainly focused on. The design was capable of producing more energy and being refueled while running, plus it had a cheaper cost to be constructed, allowing for it to be chosen. The RBMK reactor also produced plutonium, which the Soviet Union needed for their military. Because of this double use, the information on the design was kept secret. Compared to Western reactors, the RBMK reactor was not as safe and had many faults, one being a malfunction on low power. Reactor number 1 was the first to be created in the power plant on September 26, 1977. Later came reactor number 2 on February 11, 1978. Chernobyl soon became one of the biggest power plants in the early 1980s as the years passed and more reactors were created. This factor was significant in providing energy for the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. At approximately 3 kilometers from the plant, on February 4, 1970, Pripyat was being built. This town was a home for the workers and families. In a couple of years, Pripyat had a population of 50,000 people by 1979, the majority being plant employees. Formerly, Chernobyl was seen as a secure factory, and Pripyat was an ordinary town in the Soviet Union. Reactor number 4 was to have a safety test regarding if the turbine could generate energy to fuel for emergency shutdowns during any emergencies on April 25, 1986. The safety test had failed multiple times in the past, so the deputy chief engineer Anatoly Dyatlov was watching over it. During that afternoon, the operators were lowering the reactor's energy. An unexpected call from the Kyiv electrical grid had them delay the shutdown, and the reactor was on low power for many hours. On April 26, 1986, in the early morning, different workers, including Supervisor Alexander Akimov and Senior Control Engineer Leonid Toptanov, were stressed into finishing the test, even with the reactor being unstable. The reactor fell to a dangerously low level at 12:28 a.m. The operators had broken basic operating procedures like disabling different safety systems just to recover the power. The safety test finally started at 1:23 a.m., and huge amounts of energy burst out. Alexander Akimov had demanded to enable the AZ-5 emergency shutdown that required for a control rod to be inserted to hold the reactor. The control rod was supposed to slow down the reactor, but instead created a quick surge of power. In the next 36 seconds, there was a ginormous explosion through reactor number 4. It tore off the 2,000-ton top, and the core was uncovered. Another explosion had soon occurred, starting fires and spreading enormous quantities of radioactive material throughout the atmosphere. Just in a couple of minutes, calls and emergency announcements were being made, alerting nearby towns and allowing firefighters to be sent off. Lieutenant Volodymyr Pravik, the head of Fire Station Number 6, and his team, including Lieutenant Vasily Ignatenko and Pripyat, were one of the first to come to the scene. The team was required to extinguish the fires on the roof of the reactor and turbine hall, but didn't have enough gear to protect from the deadly radiation. The firefighters had either rushed to the torn-apart roof or the turbine hall and cooling pools to discard the graphite pieces from the open reactor at 1:35 a.m. The Soviet post-accident reports explained that the first responders were exposed to high doses of radiation from not enough gear and dealt with radiation syndrome, burns, nausea, and hospitalization. Of the many firefighters that went into the reactor, 28 had been sent to a hospital immediately, and the others died from exposure. Most of the fires around reactor number 4 had decreased at 5 a.m., so the other reactors didn't keep getting damaged. The first responders' courage did slow down the progress of the radiation spread, but at the cost of their lives. They were one of the first to die from the tragedy and are seen as a human sacrifice at the start of the Chernobyl disaster. Around 36 hours after the explosion at reactor number 4 on the morning of April 27, 1986, the people in Pripyat were still not completely aware of the danger they were in. The Soviet officials had at last ordered for the residents to be evacuated, and it's documented in the internal government memos, demanding all 50,000 people to leave. The military officers and police coordinated the traffic, while the local party officials dealt with buses and transportation within the city. Any school staff and teachers assisted in the evacuation of the students from the classrooms and school to make sure the families could leave securely. The residents were told to bring along only important essentials because officials thought the evacuation to be temporary. Citizens were forced to leave behind homes, schools, stores, items, and the most valuable memories. Authorities had delayed the public alerts regarding the radiation exposure, so many residents had long-term health problems, as shown in the declassified Soviet documents. Frozen in time, just in a couple of hours, Pripyat had become an abandoned town overnight as buses and other transportation took residents across the 30-kilometer exclusion zone. The Soviet Union sent thousands of cleanup workers starting in May 1986, known as liquidators, to collect the damage from the tragedy. Most of the liquidators consisted of soldiers, firefighters, engineers, miners, and volunteers, a bunch not even knowing the consequences of being near the radiation. Soviet military orders for the liquidators had been to remove any radioactive waste and decontaminate any structure. After failure through using robots from radiation exposure, humans were forced to clear radioactive graphite and other litter on reactor number 4's roof, no matter how dangerous. To try and limit the exposure, every liquidator could only be on the roof for 40 to 90 seconds. However, the exposure was still far exceeding safety. Coal miners were ordered to dig a tunnel underneath the reactor to put in a heat exchanger to make sure there wasn't a steam explosion on May 13, 1986. The concrete sarcophagus was an essential structure used to seal the reactor from the open on December 14, 1986. Valery Legasov was a significant scientist that advised the government. Although the liquidators had reduced radiation spread, like the first responders, many lives had suffered health issues, including death. The chief engineer, Nikolai Fomin, and plant director, Viktor Bukhanov, first said the reactor was together even though reactor number 4 was fully destroyed. Because there were inaccurate reports on the reactor, the warnings were a little delayed for the local Communist Party officials in Kyiv and Moscow. The Chernobyl disaster was finally announced globally on April 28, 1986, due to the workers at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden, explaining high radiation levels on their clothes. The Swedish officials soon figured that this wasn't a domestic leak and approached the International Atomic Energy Agency to question the Soviet Union. The Soviet state that exact day released a 20-second announcement regarding the Chernobyl disaster, not explaining the cause or radiation. Even though the Soviet authorities knew about the radiation spread, they still continued with May Day parades in Kyiv on May 1, 1986, with many people being exposed to the radiation. Finally, the government had decided to hand out potassium iodide tablets only in certain areas. These were used to protect against radioactive absorption. Mikhail Gorbachev delivered his first address stating that Chernobyl was a serious test for the Soviet state on May 14, 1986. The Chernobyl disaster had short-term effects, including the residents of Pripyat being evacuated soon after the explosion and the first responders and liquidators having first-hand contact with the radiation. In the long term, there were radiation-related illnesses, psychological trauma, and lasting environmental contamination. When the IAEA had made early notification and international aid procedures, this reformed nuclear safety standards. Globally, governments had better emergency planning and overseeing health. The tragedy continues to influence nuclear safety internationally.